Throughout history, there have been nations that have shaped the modern world as we know it. Many of these nations are spoken of in everyday life, such as the Greeks and Romans. Yet from the windy steppes of East Asia came nations the likes of which were never before seen. These nations were the nations of the steppes. Amongst these nations were the mighty Xiongnu, terrorizing the border of China, the Huns and White Huns that swept all foes in their path, and the Mongols, who brought the Roman Empire to their knees. The nomadic tribes of the East Asian steppes influenced the politics, culture, and economy of Rome, China, and India in ways that have shaped the modern world.
Rome was a great empire. At its peak, the Roman Empire encompassed almost 1.7 million square miles. However, after the split of the empire, the Western Roman Empire was terrorized by the Huns. The Huns were a nomadic people group that were divided into many tribes. They possessed excellent equestrian abilities and were very skilled with bows. When they united under a single ruler, they became a formidable fighting force. The Romans originally had a peace treaty with Attila the Hun, in which they paid a tribute to him. When the Huns demanded double, the Romans agreed. However, they did not pay, warranting 2 attacks from Attila. Attila the Hun organized an army in the 5th century CE and attacked Rome. Rome had Germanic people on their borders since they didn't want them entering the empire. Those people were ravaged by the Huns as they advanced through the Western Roman Empire all the way to Constantinople. This consequently led to the Germanic people seeking shelter inside the Roman Empire. Later, the Visigoths, led by Alaric, would go on to put a definitive end to the Western rule of the Romans and sack Rome. The Huns both directly and indirectly caused the downfall of the Western Roman world. The Romans were forced to pay tribute to the Huns. The Huns made a treaty with the Romans in 4th century CE that would require them to pay twice as much, but apparently the Romans refused to pay, prompting the Huns to attack. In their largest attack, the Huns ransacked Rome, going almost as far as Constantinople, taking loads of plunder as well as taking many prisoners. When the Germanic people attacked, they too stole many valuable items. Other Eastern nomads indirectly affected the Roman Empire by disrupting trade along the Silk Road. Although eventually dealt with by the Chinese, this impacted trade between the East and the West. In the case of the Romans, most of the cultural effect of nomadic tribes was simply destruction. The Huns pushed neighboring Germanic tribes into the western half of Rome, destroying it. However, this effect was lessened by the survival of the eastern half of Rome, the Byzantine Empire. This would lead to some parts of the old Roman culture, such as their old gods, to be forgotten, in favor of a Christian medieval Byzantine Empire. The Germanic tribes that inhabited what used to be Western Rome, especially the Franks, created what would become the Holy Roman Empire, combining Roman and Byzantine ideas to form its own distinct Romano-Germanic culture.
The Gupta Empire of India, despite also being in Asia, had a separate culture from the Chinese. This period in Indian history lasted from the 3rd century CE to the 6th century CE and is often called the Golden Age of India by historians. However, they faced a nomadic threat from the White Huns early on in their history. The White Huns, also known as the Hephthalites, were a nomadic tribe that originated from an area north of the Great Wall of China. Throughout history, the White Huns have been known to terrorize and conquer, but none of their attacks compare to their conquest of India and contribution to the fall of the Gupta Empire. In the 4th century, at the height of the Gupta Empire, at the end of Chandragupta II's campaigns, the White Huns were suppressed and subjugated. However, this would not be the last that the Gupta Empire would see from the White Huns. The White Huns, subjugated merely 40 years ago, rose again and fought against the Gupta Empire. Though at first being unsuccessful, they kept fighting and eventually drained the resources of the Gupta Empire in an attack around 455 CE. Following the death of the last Gupta emperor, Skandagupta, the grandson of Chandragupta II, the empire seemed to crumble. By the year 500, large parts of India were already invaded and conquered by the White Huns and other nomadic tribes. This invasion and fall of the Gupta Empire led to a power vacuum in India. Originally, a king by the name of Toramana, a leader of the White Huns, conquered parts of Pakistan and northwest India and established a kingdom for the White Huns. However, this only lasted a few years, and India soon crumbled into many kingdoms with chieftain leaders. Prior to the fall of the Gupta Empire and the invasion of the White Huns, the Gupta Empire was engaged in trade with the Byzantine Empire, China, and Rome. The Gupta Empire transported goods by the Silk Road, the Indian Ocean, and the Red Sea. They exported ebony, silk, fur, leather goods, iron products, ivory, pearl, and pepper, and due to the exclusivity of most of these exports, this is where the Gupta Empire obtained most of its resources. When the White Huns invaded, the Gupta Empire could no longer focus on trading and had to focus on fending off the invaders. This in turn diminished their trade and helped lead to the fall of the Gupta Empire. Though the White Huns greatly affected both the economy and politics of India, they barely changed the culture of it. Well before their invasion, Chandragupta II used a united front against the White Huns, delivering a crippling defeat to them and driving them out of the subcontinent for almost half a century. This unified India culturally and gave them pride in their nation. Other than this case, before their actual invasion, there was no significant cultural impact made by the White Huns on the Gupta Empire. Their kingdom lasted for a short time, so there was no foothold to infuse their culture into India. However, the nomadicity of the White Huns also negatively affected their ability to diffuse their culture into others.
China is a great civilization that is responsible for many inventions, such as paper, gunpowder, silk, and the compass that have shaped the course of humanity. China is located in Asia and is a symbol of the East. It has a distinct culture from the Western influence of Rome. China was constantly engaged in battle with the Mongols and the Xiongnu. The Xiongnu were a nomadic people that lived in the steppes to the west of Asia. They were excellent horseback archers, and their maneuverability made them incredibly effective against the Chinese military. To combat the Xiongnu, the Chinese built the Great Wall of China. It required a vast amount of not only manpower, but also a great deal of wealth. The wall required hundreds of thousands of soldiers and workers laboring away for many years to construct it. The modern estimation for the price of the construction of the Great Wall is $360 billion. This outrageous amount was the sweat, blood, and work of multiple generations of the Chinese. This manpower and generational bridge united China as a people and has served as one of the greatest testaments to the power of the nation of China. This symbol has a very utilitarian purpose. It served as a divider between China and the hostile savage lands to the north. The Xiongnu can be credited as the driving force behind the completion of the Great Wall of China. The wall, even after built, required vast funds to maintain. Thousands of troops garrisoned the length of the wall, and they had to be fed, clothed, and equipped in order to defend their land from the Xiongnu. Constant attacks also hurt merchants, which was detrimental for trade, and during times when the Chinese were weak, they were forced to pay tribute to the Xiongnu
in exchange for safety.
The nomads were fearsome fighters that contributed to the downfall of many Chinese dynasties. 3 dynasties in particular were heavily influenced by the nomads. The first emperor of the Han dynasty, Liu Bang, was nearly captured by the Xiongnu in an attack on his capital. As a result, Liu Bang changed the way China was to be governed. At the beginning of his dynasty, Liu Bang tried to govern in a manner that was between the loose rule of some of the earlier dynasties, without fully adopting the legalist practices used by Qing Shi Huangdi. During the Xiongnu attack, his family didn't support him, so he abandoned his original plan and chose to use the legalist system with a centralized government, a system that has affected China for centuries.
The Zhou
dynasty, the longest reigning dynasty in Chinese history, came to power after defeating all other competitors. This rise to power came due to the war-hardened combat veterans that Zhou possessed. These troops had gained experience while fighting their northern neighbors the Xiongnu. Zhou used this to their advantage and defeated all the weaker, less experienced armies. The Yuan dynasty was a dynasty created from the Mongol conquest started by Genghis Khan that conquered vast portions of China. His grandson Kublai Khan finished his efforts, and in 1271 the Yuan dynasty was created. It had a Chinese-style government, but since they weren't fully Sinicized and relied on foreigners for their bureaucracy, they were overthrown. However, the Yuan dynasty had many notable achievements, including printing paper money and creating an extremely accurate calendar. The effect on Chinese culture from East Asian nomads, or lack thereof, is caused by the Sinicization of the nomads. In this process, the nomads would become more like the Chinese and lose some of their former traditions. Sinicization has occurred through different methods in the history of China. In 51 BCE, the Xiongnu Empire was split in half, with one half submitting to the Chinese and eventually assimilating into Chinese society, while the other half was driven away. Chinese emperors also married off Chinese princesses to Xiongnu leaders in an attempt to maintain tranquil borders with the Xiongnu. These princesses brought their own culture and ideas along with them. They also brought servants who would further spread Chinese culture to the Xiongnu. However, the Xiongnu and other nomads made one particularly important contribution to Chinese culture. Buddhism spread to China from oasis towns along the Silk Road to the nomadic people and then to China. Buddhism became an integral part of Chinese culture and has a large effect on China today.
Not the emperor, who went out to discuss and negotiate with Attila, and who was actually, those negotiations led to him not sacking the city. So what's important about that is that by the time the Han are coming into Italy and into Europe, authority of the political powers had diminished, and the only real power that represented Rome and Roman authority was the Roman Church. And it was the Pope who was the leader at that time. So again, the sort of broader question, though, perhaps, was the fact that when the Hun came in, you had a couple of things. One, you had the introduction of things like the saddle into European warfare. So in the long term, what that would mean is that the soldier on horseback would be sort of the prime figure on the battlefield, and therefore it took a while, but eventually, the armored knight, the heavily armored cavalry soldier. So it sets the stage for those things we think about in terms of the Middle Ages, knights and knightly warfare and that kind of thing. But that takes many years. But the saddle is the first kind of thing, and that's brought in with the Hun. Another thing is that the Hun displace the Magyars or Hungars from the region we now know as Hungary, and it becomes the land of the Hun there. So they sort of withdraw into that area.
Okay. Our second question is, in your opinion, what could Rome have done to defend better against the invasion of the Huns?
Probably nothing at that point, because what had happened is a long-term process. I mean, the thing you need, and this is your topic about, what do nomadic people do? So with the collapse of the Han dynasty back in the 3rd century, a group of nomadic people up near Mongolia, called the Yuan Confederacy, they extended down into China, and then they began pushing west. That pushed the Hun even further west than the Han dynasty had done. And so they're moving across Asia. They try attacking into Afghanistan and trying to get into India, but the Persian Empire under the Sasanians, the Sasanian Empire, are for about 150 years able to ward them off. So the Hun keep moving west, and they hit the eastern part of the Roman Empire. But at that point, the Eastern Roman Empire is very strong, and it's still continuing. But as they're moving, they are pushing other groups of nomadic people. And as they move into Europe, Eastern Europe and into Central Europe, they're running into the Germania. right? And the Germanii people are being pushed west and are looking for the protection of the Roman Empire and want to be like the Romans. So this becomes what we know as the barbarian invasions, but it's really more like a wave migration, these various waves of migration. They're not really invading, they actually want to be Romans. So for instance, you have the Goths coming in, and in particular, the Goths are coming in. They're the first major Germanic invaders into the Western Roman Empire, and they asked the Roman Senate, Alaric, the leader, asked the Roman Senate if they can get Roman citizenship. But at that time, remember, Constantine had moved the empire, the capital of the empire, east. And Rome was having economic problems as a result, amongst other things. And they said, no, we can't afford it. We can't afford to have more citizens. And so the Goths do sack Rome, right, in 410. And that shocks the world, right? And then the Romans then say, yes, okay, you can have citizenship. And they give them land in the Iberian Peninsula. So they become the Western Goths or the Visigoths. And then you have another group of Germanic people, pastoral people, the Franks. They come in, and then they're followed by the Lombards, and then the Burgundians, and they're all settling in the empire. And the Roman Empire in the West can't afford really to defend, so they're just pulling their forces further and further back, leaving this vacuum of power. So there really wasn't much the Western Roman Empire could do. Once Constantine had moved everything east, and power was in the east, the Western Roman Empire just couldn't afford to defend itself. So short of the Eastern Roman Empire suddenly taking a huge interest in somehow getting back into it, which they do briefly during Justinian's reign, but then withdraw back after that. There was really nothing they could do. So once the Hun come in, they're coming in from behind, all these Germanic people coming in, there just wasn't anything left. And it's just within a few years after the Hun come in that the Roman emperor in the West, this sort of vice emperor, leaves and heads east. And then Italy becomes a Germanic kingdom, and the Franks take over what is France today, and the Angles ultimately take over what's England today, and all of that. So I don't think they could have done anything. I think it was sort of systemic. They weren't going to be able to defend themselves. Because they weren't really defending themselves, right? It was a migration. It wasn't like a war. I mean, there was some, but it wasn't this massive invaders conquering the territory. It was much slower kind of morphing that was going on.
Our third question is, how did the Mongol invasion of China affect the economy of the time, and are there repercussions today?
Okay, so we're talking about the Mongol invasion of China. Of course, it affects China in terms of this dynasty is displaced, and you have foreign rulers, or the Yuan dynasty, with Kublai Khan being the most famous of those rulers. So what it did for China is, by the time of the Mongol invasions, China's economic power had shifted south, and the port, the Indian Ocean trade had become important, and that was China's outlet. But the Silk Road, famous Silk Roads, those had gone into decline. And so what the Mongols did, since they built an empire that extended basically from China all the way to the Mediterranean and even into Eastern Europe, they actually encouraged the reopening of those and reestablishing of those and establishing way stations and things like that. So China gets sort of reopened up, from the period of the Han Dynasty where they're beginning to open up, and then the shift south at the end of the Sung Dynasty with the Yuan Dynasty, the Mongol Dynasty. It reopens the Silk Roads. So you start having the first, for instance, Europeans coming to China, Marco Polo, for instance. Before that, Franciscan missionaries coming in. But you've got all these people from Central Asia coming in too, and people from India coming in. And so it's reconnecting trade. So really it's going to kind of boost the Chinese economy, especially in northern China. So it's going to be very helpful. It's going to be an economic center that from West Asia right to East Asia as a result of the Mongols, sort of an economic revival. So again, the idea, we tend to focus on the Mongols as sort of violent destroyers, which they did initially. But once they settled, once you had the empire and you had the different khanates and they're all cooperating, it actually became this very orderly society. You call it the Pax Mongolia, right? Where it's a piece where travelers could travel and merchants could travel and trade. But still, I would have to say that the more impact was not on China as much as it was on the rest. Because China's sort of the economic center of the world. China's using paper money that the Mongols sort of start using across Asia, which encourages the trading economy. I mean, so it's still going to encourage more of Chinese ideas spreading west than sort of Western ideas spreading east.
China and India differ from their far west neighbors in that they both were not only harassed by the nomadic tribes of the eastern steppes, but were also taken over. In China, the Mongols succeeded in complete takeover and installed their own leader upon the Chinese throne, leading to the Yuan dynasty. In India, the White Hun king, Tunhina, was the first of their kings in India. The Hephthalites' rule in India lasted from 455 AD until 670 AD, when Lakhana died. During this 200-year period, the White Huns successfully integrated into the general populace. Rome was constantly threatened by barbarian incursions after the separation, forming two separate states. The Western Empire experienced never-ending harassment from the Huns and were forced to pay vast sums to the Huns in order to save Rome from sacking. The Romans were able to pay these sums with encouragement from the Huns and remained autonomous. Eventually, the Huns under their king Attila were defeated in the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. The might of the Huns was repelled by a coalition under Flavius Aetius of Rome and Theodoric I of the Visigoths. In China and India, there were no such alliances to be made, and so they were unable to repulse foreign invaders and fell to their rule. Amongst all of the nomadic tribes of the eastern steppes, many elements connect them. All were highly mobile, moving their herds with them and never staying in one place for too long. As a consequence, they could not practice agriculture and had adapted by raiding and taking what they needed from agrarian settlements. Constant raiding led to great hostility when they rose to power. As a consequence, these foreign oppressors were quickly overthrown, or in the case of the Huns, were decimated in battle. Even with their limited time, they were able to greatly and drastically influence their subjects and leave traces of their culture, even after being defeated. Another similarity lies within the treaties of the nomadic people. Although many treaties were created between the Huns and Romans and the Xiongnu and the Chinese, treatises offered momentary respites from the eastern steppes tribes, but were not fully upheld, and in almost all cases the nomadic people would continue to harass and plunder. One of the greatest abilities and advantages the nomadic tribes of the eastern steppes possessed was their ability to quickly and rapidly adapt. The Huns swept through Europe swiftly, decimating any who opposed, while sparing those who surrendered. The Mongols were early practitioners of chemical warfare, and during the siege of Kaffa, the Golden Horde lobbed plague-ridden bodies into the city in order to wipe out the populace. Due to their common place of origin, each of the steppe nations were closely tied in their practices and culture. All in all, these findings tell a great story of humanity that is often left out. When people think of nomadic tribes, they may often assume that they are living an almost extinct hunter-gatherer lifestyle, and that their primitive ways are born from their lack of participation in the agricultural revolution. However, they use their herding techniques and lifestyle, coupled with their fighting mobility and advanced tactics, to topple some of the greatest nations the earth has ever seen. These steppe peoples have been seen as an abnormality once compared to great civilizations, and yet they are one of the most influential groups throughout all time on earth.